and Immigration Bill.
Finance number 2 bill, second reading.
Now,
I have to announce as well that the reason amendment in the name of the SNP, in the name of Drew Hendry, has been selected, and I call the Minister to move second reading. Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I beg to move that the bill be read a second time. Last month, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, set out a budget to deliver on the priorities of the Prime Minister and his government, and in the context of an improving economic picture. Inflation has more than halved, down from its peak of 11.1% to 3.2%, and real wages have increased for the 9th month in a row and are now growing at an average annual real rate of 1.9%. The finance bill we are debating today builds on these improvements. It does so by seeking to reward work and by boosting the housing market, improving the tax system and strengthening the economy. This follows on from our national insurance cuts, which, when combined with the autumn reductions, mean 27 million employees will get an average tax cut of £900 a year and 2 million self-employed a tax cut averaging £700 a year. All made possible because we have a plan for growth and for better and more efficient public services. This finance bill covers 24 different measures in total, and today I will outline its most substantive powers.
that's excellent. Will he consider a further measure to right a historic injustice? Would he entertain in the committee an amendment to allow those caught up in the loan charge access to a tribunal?
I thank my right honourable friend for his comments. We've had a discussion over the loan charge previously. I don't believe an amendment would be in order on this particular bill, but I can say to the honourable gentleman, right honourable gentleman and others that I am always open to hearing concerns about the loan charge. I have done previously and will happily continue to hear information, evidence and concerns from colleagues.
I thank the Minister for coming to the House to present the budget for the House. Minister, every one of us will know over this last few weeks, indeed this last 6 months, farmers have been under exceptional weather pressure. Such as that weather pressure, it means that the indications are that farmers won't be able to cultivate their land, plough their land, sow their crops, with the result. The Minister referred to inflation coming down. By the way, I'm glad that it's dropping. We all should be. If we're not, there's something wrong with us. But at the same time, inflation can't come down if foodstuffs start to rise. Has the Minister had any opportunity to consider that very issue? How we can help farmers in a difficult time to keep the food prices down and thereby and ensure that the inflation that the Minister is referring to can actually continue to drop?
Yes. Can I thank the right honourable gentleman for his positive welcome of the inflation news today. He's right that it is welcome, but it's always something we need to keep an eye on. The points he's raising about farmers, I would like to join him in thanking our farmers. They've played a pivotal role in helping food prices come down, and of course the supermarkets have a role in this area as well. He's raising some points that are slightly outside of the remit of this particular bill, but I can assure him that I will continue to have conversations with ministerial colleagues and others, and I'm sure he will as well, because we always listen to the really, really important farming community in this country who do so much to create employment and, of course, provide us with food. Now, as I said, Mr Deputy Speaker, the bill covers 24 different measures. I won't go through every single one of them today, but I do want to focus on a few key areas. And first, I will turn to how this bill rewards work. I'm sure that we all recognise a simple truth, that work should pay. We understand how hard many people up and down this country do work, and this government wants to ensure they are recognised for this, because this approach not only benefits individuals and families, it also benefits overall growth and the economy. That's why, as I mentioned, we have already taken 2 bills to cut national insurance through Parliament. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, this finance bill goes further. That's why a key measure in this bill is to increase the High Incomes Child Benefit Charge, or HICBIC, threshold from £50,000 to £60,000. In addition, the rate of the charge will be halved so that individuals continue to receive child benefit until one household member earns £80,000, taking 170,000 families out of paying this tax charge. These changes are a well-earned reward for working families up and down the country and puts pounds back into parents' pockets. certainly.
Giving way, and whilst the changes in the child benefit allowances are important, and especially helping parents who want to get into work and have their children looked after, does he accept that one of the biggest impacts of this budget on people who are working is the way in which they've been dragged into higher tax rates because thresholds have not been risen, and that in itself is having a huge disincentive effect on working families?
I think the Honourable Gentleman will recognise that, of course, he'll be aware that back in 2010 the tax-free allowance was, I think, £6,475. Because of the actions taken by this government since then, the tax-free allowance has increased to over £12,500 now. That is actually a significant real terms increase, which means that take-home pay is higher than it otherwise would have been. And then when taken in combination with other measures, it's a really important move. But also, I'm sure he wouldn't want to detract as well, the significant changes in national insurance put money back into people's pockets. We've eliminated by a third a whole category of taxation, national insurance, and that will help people working in this country as well. Yep.
Very quick, giving way, and just to reinforce his point on the increase in thresholds, the Minister says it's been a significant real increase. Actually, it's a 21% real increase, which is very significant indeed. But my question is the part of the HCBC changes that were announced in the budget that he didn't quite mention, which was the plan from 25-26 that would be based on the household budget rather than individual budget. Can you just reassure the House that HMRC are going to be up to speed to be able to implement that part of what the Chancellor's outlined?
Yes, I again thank my honourable friend. He's jumped ahead to a later part of my speech, but I'll jump to that in a moment as well, because it is a really important part of the announcements as well, the movement to household. But I should just reiterate the first points in terms of the changes that we've made. Overall, we estimate 485,000 families will gain an average of £1,260 in child benefit in 2024-25 from these changes to HITBIC. And of course, what is good for families is also good for the economy at large, as the Honourable Gentleman was pointing out, really, because the OBR estimate that through these child benefit changes, the economy will gain additional hours worked, equivalent to around 10,000 FTEs by 28-29. And going forward, we do want to ensure that the child benefit system fairly rewards families in all their diversity, including those who, for example, only one parent works. So the government will end the unfairness, for example, of single earner families in the child benefit system by administering the HITBIC on a household rather than individual basis by April 2026. And we shall be consulting on this in due course, as my honourable friend for North East Bedfordshire quite rightly highlighted. This is something we know that many people have been calling for.
Could you just give us some indication of what level of household income the Treasury have in mind for that consultation? I presume it'll be much higher than 80,000, otherwise it'll be a more punitive situation. So is it going to be 100,000, 120,000? I mean, where will it be?
I appreciate my honourable friend's inquisitiveness there, but this is the point of the consultation. We will be having a consultation, and I'm sure his views and opinions, and indeed others, will be absolutely taken into account as well. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'll now turn to how the bill will drive investment in our economy. We all recognise that investment in the economy is crucial for economic growth, supports everyone across the country and ensures our competitiveness in international markets. That's why, through this bill, the government is taking decisions for the long term to support that investment. For example, our creative industries contributed £126 billion in gross value added in 2022 and supported over 2 million jobs. By announcing over £1 billion of new release for the UK's world-leading creative industries at the spring budget, we have signalled our commitment to ensuring the sector's continued growth. For example, we will make current tax release for theatres, orchestras, museums and galleries permanent at a rate of 45% for touring theatres and museums and galleries touring productions, 40% for non-touring productions and 45% for orchestras. This will ensure that our creative industries have the support they need after the unprecedented economic shock of the pandemic. We will also further support the UK's independent film sector through a new UK independent film tax credit at a rate of 53% for films with a budget of up to £15 million, worth about £80 million a year. This will support the production of UK independent films and, of course, the incubation of UK talent admired around the world. This government is committed to supporting UK businesses, and these measures deliver on that.
The Minister for giving way. The amendment in my name sought to address the failure of the bill to bring in tax measures to ensure the continuation of oil and gas activity in Scotland, including at Grangemouth Oil Refinery. Almost 90% of levy revenue comes from Scotland, but there's precious little by way of investment in that part of the economy. A good example of that is the UK government's denial of £80 million to save Grangemouth, but at the same time signing a loan guarantee of £600 million for INEOS for activity in Antwerp in Belgium. And in a response to my honourable friend, the member for East Lothian, in a written question, the UK government has not even assessed the potential supply of that activity.
Order.
So can the minister,
the
minister not see?
Question.
Can the minister not see the perversity of spending Scottish revenue abroad while jobs in Scotland are willfully put at risk by this government?
I couldn't disagree more with the honourable member's premise. I think if anybody's shown support for the sector, this government has, in an appropriate way, whilst also encouraging the industry to decarbonise. And I'll come on to the EPL changes in a moment. But I'm afraid the honourable member, I disagree with his point. We have shown huge support for the sector in a proportionate way. Because as I said, we are taking fiscally responsible decisions to extend the energy profits levy for 1 year. We are also providing confidence and certainty to businesses in that sector by legislating for an energy profits levy price floor. That's what's in this bill. And this will effectively abolish the energy profits levy if the 6-month average for both oil and gas is at or below a set threshold. And doing so was the sector's main ask at Spring Budget 24 and could help unlock around £9 billion in uncommitted investment spend, according to Offshore Energies UK, who welcomed this decision, and I'm sorry that the honourable gentleman does not feel able to welcome it as well. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, these measures will ensure investment in our economy continues to grow. I'll now outline some measures in the bill's property package. This bill will cut the higher rate of capital gains tax on residential property from 28% to 24%, encouraging landlords and second homeowners to sell their properties, which could in fact increase revenues because there would be more transactions. And certainly.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way, and the capital gains tax cut is very much welcome. Could he outline, though, will this come into play retrospectively? So hypothetically, if a, say, Labour frontbencher happened to owe some capital gain tax, would they benefit from a Conservative tax cut?
I think I know where the honourable gentleman's heading there. Of course, I can't comment on individual tax situations. The point he's making, though, is an important one. Everybody should always pay the taxes that they are owed, and that's a principle across, I think, shared across the House. In terms of the measures, it is implemented from the 6th of April 2024, so some people may be disappointed that there isn't retrospectivity. But as I say, this measure will make more homes available to purchase for a variety of buyers, including first-time buyers. But we also need to ensure that the property system is fair and working as intended, and this government is clear. Where policies are not meeting their policy objectives, we will take action. And that's why we're also abolishing multiple dwellings relief, or MDR, a bulk purchase relief in the stamp duty and land tax regime from the 1st of June 2024. This follows an external evaluation which found no strong evidence that the relief is meeting its original objective of supporting investment in the private rented sector. And because HMRC has recorded high and clear instances of its abuse. We're also amending rules that will ensure victims of domestic abuse are not unfairly penalised if they wish to buy their first homes anonymously, and will ensure that those in difficult circumstances are not facing additional barriers to purchasing homes. And we will ensure registered providers of social housing in England and Northern Ireland are not liable for stamp duty land tax when purchasing property with a public subsidy, and exempt public bodies from the 15% anti-avoidance rate. Finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'll turn to measures that will simplify and modernise our tax system. These will make it easier to engage with the tax system and close loopholes which could be used for avoidance. Mr Deputy Speaker, the negative impacts of inefficient, complex taxes on both businesses and the wider economy cannot be understated. That's why this government is taking action to ensure the system is working for everyone. As a starting point, we are amending 2 primary VAT interest provisions in legislation to ensure that they apply to all cases intended by the policy. This will mean that the interest payments that HMRC recover are correct, as well as saving time and resources for HMRC and businesses. And because this government recognises it's everyone's responsibility to pay their fair share of tax to support our vital public services, we are closing another anti-avoidance loophole, one that enables individuals to avoid tax by moving assets abroad via a company. This is one of 200 measures that we have undertaken since 2010 to close loopholes and reduce the tax gap, which now sits at just 4.8%. That's down from 7.5% under Labour. Yes, an inconvenient truth for the opposition, who recently claimed to be so enthusiastic about tackling tax avoidance, and yet Labour didn't take these actions that we have taken when they were in power, and importantly, Labour failed to support the last finance bill, which included further measures to tackle tax avoidance. But they were in good or rather bad company because the Lib Dems and the SNP didn't either. But this isn't the first time that we've seen this, how shall I put it, distance between what the opposition say and what they do. Even recently, let's remember, the Labour Party said that they would support our national insurance tax cuts. But when it came to the vote, well, I searched the eye lobby, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I did not see a single Labour MP in there with the Conservatives actually voting for tax cuts. Nor a Lib Dem, I should add, and the SNP were in the opposition lobbies actively voting against tax cuts for their very own constituents. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, while the government is getting on with delivering on our plan to cut taxes, grow the economy and boost investment, the Labour Party would put all of this at risk and send us back to square one. Instead of taking the responsible decisions to back businesses, the Labour Party want to saddle them with new regulations. Labour's so-called New Deal for workers is in fact a bad deal for jobs, workers and businesses. The Deputy Leader of the Labour Party and the unions, 70 new regulations would ban flexible working, disincentivise small businesses from making new hires and unleash waves of low-threshold, zero-warning strikes. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
And he's quite right to point out the dangers of Labour being in charge of finances and the impact which that is likely to have on tax. But would he at least have the humility to accept that tax is higher under this government as it has been for decades?
I certainly have the humility to accept and recognise that, because taxes are higher out of the obvious and widely accepted necessity of paying for massive amounts of intervention because of the pandemic and in response to supporting families and businesses through the cost of living challenges. And therefore we make no apologies for intervening to support lives and livelihoods to the extent that that was necessary. It's absolutely vital that we did intervene, because otherwise, to have not done otherwise, would have been a disaster for the UK economy. The general level of taxation, though, as the Honourable Gentleman is probably aware, is much lower in the UK than many other countries who also had to, out of necessity, significant increased taxes and government intervention in response to the pandemic. We have much lower levels of taxation than Germany, for example, and also France and Italy and many other countries. But as I said, we have higher levels of taxation out of necessity, but now we're in a position to start to reduce those levels of taxation out of policy intent and choice. That's exactly what we're doing. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, I should say that this is a finance bill that absolutely rewards hard work, supports our vital industries, boosts the housing market and continues to create a fairer, simpler, more modern tax system. It delivers on the government's commitment to prioritise economic growth and will ensure a brighter future for our country, and for these reasons I commend the bill to the House.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. James Murray.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, for the chance to respond on behalf of the opposition in this second reading of the Finance Bill. This finance bill follows last month's budget, a budget at which the record of the Conservatives' time in office was laid bare. After 14 years, the Conservatives have shown what it is that they can deliver for the British people: higher taxes, falling living standards, and lower economic growth. And the truth is that after 14 years, they are out of time, out of ideas, and out of touch with reality. They are out of time because whatever they say or try to do now, it is too late to repair the damage they have done to the economy and to people's standard of living. The Conservatives may now have implemented a reduction to national insurance, a cut that we support, but this comes amid a tax burden that is set to rise to its highest in 70 years, and that is set to rise in each and every year of the forecast period. The government simply cannot escape the reality that for every £5 they are giving back to families, they will be taking £10 in higher taxes under their plans. Giving with one hand, taking twice as much with the other. That is the reality of life under the Conservatives. They're not just out of time, Mr Deputy Speaker, but also out of ideas. At the budget from which this finance bill came, the Conservatives performed what may be the biggest U-turn of this Parliament yet, and there is some tough competition on that. After years and years of the Conservatives opposing our plan to scrap the non-dom tax status tooth and nail, the Chancellor stood here last month and adopted our approach as his own. I recall the Financial Secretary's immediate predecessor being a particularly passionate defender of the non-dom status. I remember her declaring less than a year ago in committee stage of a previous finance bill that, and I quote, "We have come to the conclusion that non-domiciled status is right. How times change." Of course, despite the government's apparent U-turn though, we have learned since the budget, through our careful analysis of the government's plans, that loopholes remain in their approach to abolishing the non-dom tax status. Alongside an unnecessary discount in year one, a loophole also appears to have been intentionally designed to allow non-doms to stash money away in offshore trusts so they can avoid being subject to inheritance tax like any other member of the public. We believe those loopholes must be closed because we believe that if you make your home and do your business in Britain, then you should pay your taxes here too. People will look at these loopholes and rightly conclude that despite the budget's U-turn, this Prime Minister just cannot bring himself to sort out the non-dom problem once and for all. Yes.
If I may say, he's sort of clutching at straws. Now, there may be, in the efforts to tighten up supposed loopholes and what the government is proposing, a few hundred million here, a few hundred million there. But as he is aware, the Labour Party want £28 billion spent on their green investment. So which taxes is he going to raise to pay for that £28 billion?
I fear the honourable gentleman is slightly out of date in terms of what... we set out very clearly our plan going into the general election about investing in the transition we need in our energy supply and our economy, and how we would pay for that through a strengthened windfall tax and through prudent investment alongside that. We set that out very clearly, and frankly, the honourable gentleman may scoff at what we're saying about the non-dom tax loopholes, but we're talking about £1 billion in the first year. We're talking about £2.6 billion over the course of the next Parliament, and we think that is money that rightly should go to our public services rather than be intentionally designed loopholes to allow some people to get away with paying hundreds of millions of pounds in tax. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Conservatives are not just out of ideas, as is clear, but they are also out of touch with reality, as is also clear. They made that very clear in last month's budget, from which this finance bill arose, because the Chancellor, at the end of the budget speech, made an astonishing £46 billion unfunded commitment, leaving a gaping hole in the public finances when he pledged to abolish national insurance altogether. Since then, government ministers have had countless opportunities to row back from or U-turn on this commitment, but they have been determined not to do so. Earlier today, the Prime Minister had 3 chances to rule out cuts to the NHS, cuts to the state pension, or tax rises to pay for his £46 billion unfunded tax cut. Each time he refused. It is quite I will give away in a second. It is quite astonishing that they are content to go into the general election with a £46 billion black hole in their plans, and that they refuse to say whether this will be funded by tax rises elsewhere or cuts to spending. And I will give way to the honourable gentleman so he can confirm exactly how they will pay for that £46 billion black hole.
Intervene from the dispatch box, but I couldn't help myself this time. The honourable gentleman, we've had multiple conversations on this, cannot differentiate between an aspiration versus a commitment, a policy commitment. His was a policy commitment, the 28 billion. Ours is an aspiration. They are two different things. As for the scaremongering that he's saying about the hit or possible hit to pensions or the NHS, he knows full well that is absolutely not true. Because national insurance does not wholly pay for health or benefits or indeed pensions. And either he's exhibiting scaremongering or complete and utter financial illiteracy. The complete spending for the NHS is over £160 billion. Welfare spending is over £260 billion, massively dwarfing the total amount raised by national insurance. Either he doesn't understand that or he's doing irresponsible scaremongering. He's known for a long period of time national insurance and these other payments are topped up by general taxation. He should know better.
Yes, here.
Very long intervention.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Thank the Honourable Gentleman for his mini speech in response. I feel I might have touched a nerve here. And actually, when he talks about people being scared, I think, yes, people are scared when they hear the government making £46 billion of unfunded spending commitments and not saying how they're going to pay for them. Because we know when the previous Prime Minister made a tax cut of similar order of magnitude, we know what havoc that caused on the economy, and people are still paying the prices with higher mortgage payments and rent payments. So, I would only say to the Honourable Gentleman that I gave him a chance to rule out cuts to the NHS, cuts to the state pension or tax rises elsewhere to pay for this black hole. I'm not quite sure if he did or not. Maybe he hasn't got the line from his boss in number 10 Downing Street. But the truth is, until they rule that out, people will rightly worry about the impact unfunded commitment will have on the economy. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this pledge that the Honourable Gentleman is speaking about sounds like exactly the sort of pledge that the Right Honourable Member for South West Norfolk might approve of, because it is almost exactly the same amount as her government's unfunded tax cuts. Of course, the previous Prime Minister has been touring the TV studios and talking to newspaper journalists in recent days, claiming, amongst other things, that people who claim that she crashed the economy are, and I quote, either very stupid or very malevolent. I wonder if the Minister would like to intervene on me and say whether he shares that view. No, he's not leaping to his feet right now. Frankly, I would have thought he would, because I would have thought Treasury ministers would want to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the previous Prime Minister. Yeah. Instead, however, with their £46 billion unfunded commitment, they seem determined to be a tribute act. And frankly, whatever the previous Prime Minister says, people across Britain know what impact her time in office is having on all of us as we face high mortgages and high rents as a direct consequence of her economic recklessness. Mr. Deputy Speaker, that is the context in which we're debating this finance bill. That context is one of a government that is out of time, out of ideas, and out of touch with reality, and of a country that is feeling the impact of 14 years of Conservative economic failure. Even a simple clause, Mr. Deputy Speaker, like Clause 2 in this bill that sets the main rates of income tax, highlights the impact on ordinary people of decisions taken by this government. Although the basic and higher rates of income tax are unchanged by this bill at 20% and 40%, we know the tax burden on working people is rising. It is rising as a result of the income tax personal allowance and the higher rate threshold being frozen from 2021-22 to 27-28. Now, those tax thresholds would ordinarily have risen this April, but instead they are in the middle of a 6-year freeze. According to the Office of Budget Responsibility, which I assume the Honourable Gentleman has respect for, these freezes will create an extra 3.7 million extra taxpayers by 2028-29, as well as meaning that 2.7 million more people will be paying the higher rate. Because the truth is that even taking into account any reductions to national insurance rates, the freezes and thresholds and the rises in council tax mean that by the end of the forecast period, the average family will still be £870 worse off. As the Resolution Foundation noted at the time of the budget, despite the reductions in national insurance, personal taxes will still see a net rise of £20 billion a year by 2028-29. They pointed out that for those over state pension age who do not benefit from national insurance cuts, they will be particularly badly hit with an average tax rise of £960 a year. The reality has been summed up by Paul Johnson, the Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who said, following the budget, that this remains a parliament of record tax rises. That is the record of the Conservatives in government. Now, yes.
There's a certain leader of the opposition who, when standing to be the leader, made a #1 pledge on economic justice to increase income tax for 5% for earners and reverse corporation tax. That pledge, does that still stand as a direct policy that his government, if there was to be voted in, would stand by? Because that too would increase the tax burden significantly.
I'm sorry, I wasn't quite following the honourable gentleman's point, but if I can just respond to the general point I think he was making. We've been very clear that this is a parliament of record tax rises. The tax burden is set to be its highest in 70 years, and we think the tax burden on working people should be lower. But we would only ever support tax rises if they are responsible and if they are done on the basis of economic security and stability. I'm going to make some progress on this because I've made that point quite clearly. Because alongside pushing the tax burden to a record high, we've also seen a record number of changes and U-turns when it comes to tax rates and reliefs under this government. That applies not just to personal taxation, but also to the tax rates and reliefs that apply to businesses too. Let us consider the approach of the current Chancellor to the rate of corporation tax, which this bill sets at 25% in Clause 12. Now, in July 2022, during his leadership bid, the current Chancellor pledged to cut the headline rate of corporation tax from 19% to 15%. Yet when he became Chancellor, just 3 months later, one of his first acts was to U-turn on what he inherited and commit to raising that tax from 19% to 25%. The current Chancellor has been typical of the Conservatives in lacking any certainty, predictability or consistency, and we know just how damaging this is to businesses trying to make investment decisions. As the Shadow Chancellor has set out, if we win the next general election, we will bring back certainty by capping the headline rate of corporation tax at its current rate of 25% for the whole of the next Parliament. We would take action if tax changes in other advanced economies threaten to undermine UK competitiveness, because we believe the current rate of 25% strikes the right balance between what our public finances need and, as the lowest rate in the G7, keeping our corporation tax competitive in the global economy. Now, alongside the headline rate, we also recognise the importance of stability and predictability in the reliefs that are available to businesses. We have seen a great deal of chopping and changing in capital allowances in recent years. I think, in fact, this bill is remarkable in being a rare finance bill from this government that does not change the annual investment allowance or the expensing regime. We have made clear that if we win the next general election, we will publish a roadmap for business taxation in the first 6 months in office to give businesses the stability, predictability and long-term plan that is so important to those making investment decisions. Now, of course, we recognise that we have been pushing for a proper windfall tax on the profits of oil and gas companies operating in the North Sea. The government, despite initial opposition, U-turned on that and adopted some of our proposals with the introduction of the Energy Profits Levy. Ahead of the general election, we have set out our plans to make the windfall tax stronger, to raise more revenue to support our country's energy transition. But it is also right that we give as much certainty as possible to those companies affected.
For giving way. Does he agree with me that we need a domestic oil and gas and offshore energy sector to deliver for the economy and to deliver energy security and bring in the investment needed for transition? After all, the North Sea has powered our economy and our country for decades and can do for decades to come.
I would thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and she's right to say that it is important we offer as much certainty as possible to those companies who are affected. And if I set out our position on this, which is that we recognise by its very nature the windfall tax is expected to be a one-off levy in response to extraordinary profits and will ultimately come to an end. We've set out that if we win the next general election, the Energy Profits Levy will end no later than the end of next Parliament. We also fully support the Energy Security Investment Mechanism in Clause 19 of this bill and the signal it gives to help investor confidence in the UK's offshore energy sector. Mr Deputy Speaker, we will not be opposing this bill at its second reading today, and we look forward to the detailed consideration of its clauses at committee stage. But the wider context in which this bill has been published lays bare the record of the Conservatives in government. That record is one of falling living standards for people across Britain and the highest tax burden in 70 years. It is one of economic stagnation from a party that is out of ideas and that has been unable to provide the stability that businesses need. And it is one of recklessness with the public finances, both when the last Prime Minister crashed the economy and now with the current Prime Minister making a £46 billion unfunded pledge to scrap national insurance. It is time to turn a page and turn a corner, time to give the British people the chance to change our country's government by calling a general election.
Richard Fuller.
Indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker, I wholeheartedly support the bill for its second reading. I have a couple of points to make to my honourable friend before I get to my speech and a couple of responses to the Shadow Minister that he may be interested to hear. My honourable friend, in response to the member for New Forest West on the loan charge, said he wasn't minded to accept an amendment but to always listen. I like the Minister. He will be aware that the loan charge has created significant concerns and problems for people. He will be aware that the loan charge policy has been in place for a very long time and has not made the progress that was anticipated initially. Can I say to my friend that it is time to draw a deadline on that policy and for HMRC to find a different way to provide resolution and, may I say, also relief to those affected? No, I won't if I may not. Number two, you can speak. Oh, okay then.
Would you accept that not only has it failed to bring in the revenue which the government intended to bring in from it, but it has actually led to a number of people committing suicide because of the pressure which has been put on them by HMRC?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend on the opposition bench has voiced the concern that I know will rest on the conscience of my friend, the Minister, and he's right to add that. Can I put a second conscientious point to the Minister, which is also a point that the Shadow front bench may want, which is related to the scoring for contaminated blood. This was not included in the budget. This will have disappointed a considerable number of members of Parliament on both sides of the House. It would be helpful if the Chancellor could come forward with some view of that. Again, I think it's something, if I could ask my honourable friend to look at. Number three, will the Minister be encouraged by the words of my right honourable friend, the member for Wokingham, and his analysis of the charges imposed on the Treasury by the Bank of England as a result of the quantitative tightening policies? The UK policies on quantitative tightening are exceptional. There are very few other central banks, many of whom indulged in the bizarre quantitative easing policy for 15 years, started back in the after financial crash, after the last Labour government. But it now is a real charge that has real effects on the real economy in the country. And so that exceptional way that we're treating quantitative tightening charges, which is to essentially, we take them on the books, the Treasury gets charged for it, it has to go into the scoring that the OBR and others take part. It doesn't go on in other European countries. There's discretion on how that can be put across. And in the US, they absorb them, but they don't charge the government. So I think that's important. It's an important policy point. I'd be interested if he has a view about whether he'd accept an amendment on that at committee stage. I think not. And then very prosaically or simply, HMRC, as we know, has been in the headlines for not answering phone calls and pretending they were going to go on holiday. I'm very pleased the Minister reversed that straight away, and I know many taxpayers will be pleased about that. And many people who will be looking to fill in their self-assessment forms will be surprised that they can't download Form SA100, that they actually have to call HMRC to download a copy of SA100, whether they want to file it by paper or not. That seems to me to be a little odd if you're under pressure on your phone line. So could this Minister, who's been very responsive on points to date, look into that? Turning to the Shadow spokesman with his speech, I like him too. I would say, as he in his own mind, quote unquote, prepares for government, he may wish, and indeed his colleagues may wish to get a better grasp on reality, because when he rightly talks about the importance of setting clarity for investment, it's important that those who are looking to investment think the people who are in charge of the public finances actually know what's going on. And he talked about record tax rises, right, under this government. So let me ask him these points. Did he disagree with funding of the furlough programs? Did he disagree with the energy price support? Did he disagree with the increase in funding for the NHS? Did he disagree with record numbers of police officers? If he didn't disagree with any of those, he would recognise, if he had a grasp on reality, that he would have to fund those through increased taxation or increased... Well, he's got an answer, so would you like to... No, oh, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I thought he had an answer. Please, come on.
Thank you. The honourable gentleman is asking me what I disagree with. I disagree with low growth that has been true of this government for the last 3 years. I disagree with billions of pounds being wasted in COVID fraud and other ways by this government. I disagree with the fact that this government is now overseeing the highest tax burden in 70 years and has no plan to get the economy growing. That's what I disagree with.
He mentioned 3 things. He talked about growth rates, he talked about fraud, and he talked about record tax burden. Well, the record tax burden was the point I was making, so he can't respond to that challenge by repeating that he's concerned about it. He talked about low growth. Well, he should go to Germany, lower growth than the UK. He should go to France, lower growth than the UK. He should go to the majority of G7 countries and find low growth than the UK. So he is mistaken, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that when you have... would you like to intervene again? No. But the point that my point, and I'm trying to be helpful, obviously I am, but if he wishes to be taken, if the shadow team wishes to be taken seriously, the points about growth, he will know. These are difficult to work through. Western economy is not growing as fast. The UK is growing faster on average than other countries, and I think he just needs to give some credit to that rather than just say that's the case. And more importantly, if he believes, as he did, and the party opposite supported most of these programmes, of the furlough, the energy price increase, the record increase in NHS funding, and more police, they have to recognise that in government you have to pay for that. And that means hard choices. And what the Prime Minister has done, the Chancellor has done, is make those hard choices. Making people feel bad about historical hard choices is not a policy for future government. I'm happy to give way to it.
Thank you. We seem to be engaging in an unexpected back and forth here, but he didn't talk about the COVID fraud. And as he might know, we set out our plans for a COVID corruption commissioner. Would he support that? Yes or no?
Yes.
Of course, everyone supports cracking down on fraud, and I would be very happy to have. I'd be very happy to have whatever. I would be. If I may, I would be very happy to look at the specific proposals that the Labour Party are proposing. But he will also know that when the Labour Party talk about fraud, particularly when it comes to PPE and furlough programmes, they conflate 2 things. So, for example, if you look at the coronavirus loan programmes, they conflate monies that haven't been repaid because businesses have gone bust, money that hasn't been repaid because companies haven't paid it back yet, with monies that have been lost fraudulently. So I would say to him, when I look at his proposals, I want to make sure that when they talk about the amounts that have been lost, they relate to actual examples of fraud, not to the ways in which money, in a very difficult situation where people's businesses could be closed, was used by the Treasury out to others. And if that's the case, then I'm happy to look at it. On my second point to the opposition, before I go to what I want to say, was the opposition, and I hold no torch for my right honourable friend, the former Prime Minister, but when he talks about crashing the economy, and he talks about people, and I think the Leader of Opposition did at the Prime Minister's Question Day, about mortgage rates for people, can I just urge him gently and his colleagues to look at the Bernanke review that's just been completed on Bank of England forecasting. It has a number of important points about how the Bank of England could improve its forecasting. But what it also does, and it's figure 12 in the report, is it compares interest rates for the 7 central banks that Ben Bernanke, the former head of the US Federal Reserve, has used as his comparators. And what the shadow spokesperson would see if he looks at that is that he will see that UK interest rates in 2019 we're in the middle of the pack. UK interest rates in 2020 were in the middle of the pack. UK interest rates in 2021 were in the middle of the pack. UK interest rates in 2022 were in the middle of the pack. UK interest rates in 2023 were in the middle of the pack. UK interest rates as we enter 2024 are in the middle of the pack. It is simply not true to say that there is something exceptional that happened to UK interest rates in any part of this Parliament. And again, if he wishes to be taken seriously in government, he needs to get a grip of reality, not on fantasy. Now, turning, if I may, to the things I'd like to say. Clause 12. I did promise the whips I'd only take 10 minutes, so I promise to only take 10 minutes. Clause 12 from now. Clause 12, corporation tax rates, setting corporation tax rate. And I can see that my honourable friend, the member for Mid-Bedfordshire, is here on the opposition benches. I think both he and I are very pleased that the two front benches have made clear their commitments for full expensing. This is particularly important to the people of Bedfordshire because there is a pending potential investment in my honourable friend's constituency in Mid-Bedfordshire. And I'd just like to put on record our thanks to the two front benches for being very clear and setting that clear future framework for how that will work. I'd like to turn, if I may, for my main comments, to income tax rates in Clause 2, because I think it's important that we look at the history. And my honourable friend from the front bench mentioned this. If you look at the record from 2010 of successive Conservative governments for people who are working people in this country, it is a strong record. My honourable friend mentioned the increase in the personal allowance from £6,475 in 2010 to £12,570 in this financial year. That's a 21% real increase. My honourable friend did not mention, however, the change in the minimum wage, which has gone up from £5.80 in 2010 to the living wage now of £11.44. That's a 23% real increase in wages. Higher wages for working people and lower taxes that are paid for those on lowest incomes. That's a very strong record. What my honourable friend, I think, needs to look at, however, is the higher rate threshold. Because that higher rate threshold in 2010 was £37,400. And that higher rate threshold now is £37,700. Now, in real terms, the 2010 amount in today's money would be set at £59,800. So essentially, there's been a 37% decrease in the earnings when people have to hit the higher threshold. And it may not be popular politically, but economically, such a substantial differentiation in the way we tax people on middle and high incomes to those on low incomes, long-term that has some implications. And we felt that talking after the budget, particularly to people who've retired, who've been thrifty and saved money and have a private pension, and are now find themselves complaining that, yes, they're getting their increase in the basic pension, or maybe not, but they're now being dragged into the higher rate of taxation. And so as this Conservative government, successive Conservative governments, have been governments that have rewarded work, wanted people to work hard, wanted people to be entrepreneurial, wanted people to try and grow their businesses, their economy, and the economy, please can we have a look at the ways in which that particular threshold should change. The government, quite right, the Prime Minister and Chancellor have indicated they wish to simplify taxation on working people. That is completely consistent with the long-run approach of the Conservatives to taxation on work. And reducing national insurance as an aspiration is an excellent way of looking at doing that. And I would say, unlike the opposition, that there is a difficulty in politics of finding times when you can make quite significant changes. This may well be such a time, and I know that's what the front bench will be looking at. This may be such a time. It is partially because we have quite significant issues of overall taxation that we need to reduce. But I think there is the opportunity for other reasons as well. I think because reallocation of existing taxes is easier when the tax burden is exceptionally high. Now, I'm a Conservative, I'm a low tax Conservative. I recognise, unlike some, that when you buy things, you have to pay taxes for it. But we know that this tax rate is unusually high. So we know we're going to reduce that tax burden. And so looking at ways to use national insurance reductions is a propitious time, looking out for the next 5 years to do that. Second of all, when you look at the fiscal drag, if you look at fiscal drag, in the budget, it forecasts that to be 28 billion to 33 billion per annum for the next 3 or 4 years. And so there is an ethical and moral case for the fact that we want to give back more money to people in terms of providing reductions in national insurance contributions. My proposal, though, is for the government to consider not that national insurance reductions should go directly into pay packets, but that national insurance contributions should be added to people's long-term savings through compulsory savings schemes. We need to move, and many countries have recognised that the idea of state pensions being based upon the never-never isn't really a secure way to provide for long-term pensions. We've never really grasped the nettle in this country. Singapore did it right at the start. Australia did it in the 1990s. There is an opportunity for us to build on the work that Sir Stephen Webb did in the coalition government by building on that through the changes to the national insurance contribution. That would ensure that working people will be the first generation to have a truly secure pension that's their money, where they don't have to rely on what the vagaries of a particular chance of the day might do to pensions. It means that they would go through a career with only one tax on their wages. Again, finagling people and other parties like to increase taxes, and the fact they have 2 taxes to increase gives them more flexibility. It would mean, and there's an opportunity perhaps, well, we know that Singapore has done this, where you can extend that savings state, the way that people save for things, beyond providing for their retirement, so they can use it, as they do in Singapore, for example, to put money into their first home. It seems to me that it provides a new way of us to look at the way we treat citizens in this country, that we start to make a move towards a savings state and away from a socialist never-never state. And with that comment, I'll leave to my honourable friend to consider.
Drew Hendry to move his amendment.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. This finance bill falls woefully short of the mark. The Scottish National Party has indeed submitted a reasoned amendment at the second reading because, frankly, the provisions of this bill do not rise to the immense challenges faced by our constituents, and Mr Deputy Speaker will move that at the appropriate time. The UK government seems to operate under the illusion that the Tory Brexit cost of living crisis has come to an end, yet the reality on the ground in homes across Scotland and the other UK nations tells a different story. Indeed, a poll out today shows that 61% of people, a UK poll, 61% of people think that the UK government isn't taking the measures required for the cost of living. And the bad news for Labour is they don't believe Labour is proposing the right things either. So this bill as it stands is a stark testament to a government, as we've heard, and I agree, out of touch and out of ideas, and obviously soon to be out of office. But let's be clear, the proposals laid in this bill are insufficient to support households in Scotland who continue to bear the brunt of disastrous decisions made here in Westminster. The spring budget brought devastating cuts to Scottish capital funding, yet there remains a pervasive silence among the Westminster parties about the true scale of cuts planned over the next Parliament to meet the arbitrary fiscal rules they're both slavishly following. And I note the Labour front bench said hee-haw about public service funding over the coming years, despite the fact that we know there's going to be a £20 billion hole there, which is going to lead to further misery in public services. And while there are elements in the bill, Mr Deputy Speaker, like the marginal increase in child benefit and the limited support for the film sector, which we can view as steps in the right direction, they are but drops in the ocean compared to the vast needs of our communities. So, for a UK government that claims economic competence, it's astounding how little they understand about nurturing true economic growth or indeed enhancing productivity. Austerity has failed. It cannot be made to work, yet they in the Labour Party continue to pretend that somehow this can. And we agree with the Labour Party that every £5 that's coming out of this budget for people are paying £10 back in. So the question the Labour Party have to answer is, why are they not voting against this tonight? Why are they going to sit once again on their hands and allow this to go through? And as I've said, not a word on public services. The reality is a continuing decline in disposable incomes, a shameful record in inequality, the highest in any major European country, and a GDP per capita on its longest downward trajectory since records began. Moreover, the Chancellor's measures are predicted to have minimal impact on the economic turnaround this year, and it's highly probable that this government will have overseen the worst Parliament for income growth in recent history. Now, that Scotland has the highest wages in the UK, according to median gross weekly incomes, thanks to the work of the SNP government on promoting fair wages and leading by example. However, the powers to avoid the scale of falling real incomes resides here, in Westminster. And that fall is unprecedented over the last 6 decades. Hundreds of thousands of people in Scotland and across the nations of the UK are locked in a vicious cycle of debt, with over 300,000 having missed a debt payment in the past year alone. Now, a recent report by the Financial Conduct Authority highlights that 7.4 million people across the UK are, quotes, heavily burdened by their domestic bills and credit commitments. And as of January this year, nearly 6 million UK adults reported having no disposable income at all. The ongoing cost of living crisis continues to degrade living standards, with families struggling under the weight of high food prices, exorbitant mortgage rates, and escalating energy costs, pushing more and more households into debt. And we know that food prices are about to spike yet again. And we can put that squarely down to Brexit, the love child of the Tory right, now adopted by the Labour Party and the Lib Dems. The report from Alliance Trade suggests that these controls that are coming in May will increase import costs by 10% in the first year, imposing £2 billion in extra costs on UK businesses and exacerbating the cost of living crisis. Food prices are already up by more than a quarter from a couple of years ago due to existing Brexit changes. So this is a turbo boost of what people have been facing. Where is the help for people as food bank queues grow longer and the ability to donate to those food banks dwindles? It's non-existent. Whatever the cost to households, whoever starves, make Brexit work seems to be the consensus of the Westminster parties and especially this Tory government. Even putting aside our squandered EU membership, they won't even implement the basic food protections that other governments have used and we have called for. Westminster negligence and a failure of basic values of fairness. Particularly pressing, Mr Deputy Speaker, is the escalating crisis of fuel poverty that grips many of our communities. How can it be right in the 21st century that there exists an energy poll tax of standing charges? In the Highlands and Islands, the electricity standing charge, the charge that has to be paid every single day, cold or warm, is 50% higher for households than those in London. How can that be fair? Why has the UK government sanctioned this blatant inequality? Shouldn't this bill be doing something to fix that? Now, this bill could have provided for the scrapping of standing charges, and it should be acting with urgency to start providing meaningful rebates to those people living in the highest areas of fuel and extreme fuel poverty. By the way, that's again in the Highlands and Islands. The irony is not lost on people living in an area exporting over 6 times the electricity it uses and seeing massive tax returns going to the Chancellor's Treasury while they suffer this injustice. As a bare minimum, this bill could have ushered in legislation for a long overdue social tariff. Since 2019, the Citizens Advice Bureau has reported a 14-fold increase in the number of clients seeking advice relating to fuel poverty. The average fuel debt that clients present to Citizens Advice Scotland is now over £2,300. Now, that's not merely a statistic, it's a damning indictment of the current government's policies. And meanwhile, this bill, I will give way.
He's making excellent points on fuel poverty. When I did a survey of Dalmarnock residents about the impact of fuel poverty, it had a hugely detrimental effect on their health and well-being, not even able to have family members round because their house was cold and they couldn't afford to switch the kettle on to give their family members a cup of tea. Pensioners going to bed together early because they couldn't afford to keep the heating on. Does he think the government understands the dire consequences of fuel poverty for people that are living in it?
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and I think it's a very good point. I don't think that the government understand what happens to people. I don't think they're listening to the medical advice. The article, for example, in the Lancet pointing out the health deprivations that come from living in extreme fuel poverty, or indeed the effect on children's learning and well-being over the period of time, or indeed, ironically, the higher costs on public services as a result of fuel poverty, because people have to rely on the NHS more because of health conditions. This bill is doing nothing substantial to alleviate such dire circumstances. Now, before we move on to other issues, I have to ask why this bill has no updated actions to stop companies taking advantage of the cost of living crisis. The government is aware, as is the Financial Conduct Authority, that, for example, car insurance in the UK is 34% higher, and younger drivers have seen bigger premium increases. Younger and older drivers have seen bigger premium increases than other drivers. Under 18% has been the claimed rate, 34% has been the premium increase, and average premiums for some of those age groups have jumped by over 50%. Surprise, surprise, drivers in Scotland are amongst those who have seen their premiums rise the most. This time, however, something they share with Londoners. Now, they can't put this down to the fact that there are different market forces, etc., because insurance premiums have only risen by 2% in France, 5% in Spain, and 6% in Italy. So what is going on? No action either on end-of-contract scams from mobile and broadband operators. They're allowing a cost-of-living punishing free-for-all to continue while they're distracted feeding their culture wars and giving peerages to pals and donors. While the UK government remains idle, pretending that the cost of living crisis has ended, the Scottish government has taken proactive steps to tackle inequality and reduce child poverty, implementing game-changing policies like the Scottish Child Payment, which has lifted 100,000 children out of fuel poverty. Yet it's an uphill swim to protect families while Westminster makes these big and wrong decisions. Austerity continues to hinder necessary investments essential for Scotland's burgeoning industries. Brexit has disastrously impacted on our economic activity, international standing and business confidence. Investment in the UK remains the lowest amongst the G7 countries. Now, it's common for the Tories and indeed the Labour Party to say that there's no magic money tree when it comes to public finances, and that's why they must always cut to follow their so-called fiscal rules. But here's the rub. The closest thing we did have to a magic tree was our EU membership, and one that we should and could still be adding to our reserves. And according to research for Bloomberg, Goldman Sachs, Cambridge and others, around 5% of our annual GDP is being lost at the moment because of Brexit. If we had that back, that would generate well over £100 billion per year, generating a potential tax take for the Treasury of over £40 billion per annum. We could plug these holes. We don't have to be going through this, and yet that's the path that has been decided for us. So they've hacked that tree down to mulch. Now, for both of them, all they can do is promise more cuts. The bill fails business and industry too. Now, the SNP has long advocated for a £28 billion annual investment and a robust green industrial strategy to harness the full potential of the green transition. The Labour Party used to agree. Indeed, their advisers are annoyed that they're not going forward for it, but of course they've reversed on that policy, as we had confirmed earlier. This is essential if we want to make our climate change targets, and indeed it's an industry that, as we stand at the moment as part of this UK, one of the few industries that the UK could take forward with gusto. So despite obvious needs, what does the UK government do? It's only recently decided to boost funding in Allocation Round 6 for offshore wind projects, an effort still inefficient to meet necessary targets. Following the failure of the 5th round of contract for difference allocations to secure any new products, it's unacceptable that the government has failed to rectify the shortfall in deployed capacity, leaving us well behind our 21 gigawatt target for the upcoming rounds. Mr Deputy Speaker, today's finance bill is a testament to the UK government's ongoing failure to adequately invest in the renewable sector, endangering, as I've said, our net zero targets, jeopardising energy security and stunting the long-term growth of Scottish communities as a result. It's time for a drastic change, and we need a government that is going to be aligned with the needs of the Scottish people in the future, and that is an independent Scottish government. Now, and also in this bill, where is the action to help our tourism and hospitality industries? Now, selective cuts to VAT would have been a mechanism that could have been deployed to help our tourism and hospitality sectors. It could and should have been used to help struggling high streets and town centres. Where is the VAT-free shopping that business organisations were crying out for? Now, as I mentioned earlier, the spring budget has introduced... I will give way on that.
I'm very grateful to Honourable Penny for giving way on that point on VAT-free shopping. We led the charge a number of years ago on the extra statutory concession on the removal of VAT-free shopping at airports, which was crucial to the airport, Glasgow Airport. In my constituency, we even managed to get on a member from Murray to vote with us on that occasion, but yet we've still seen no action from this government to conclude that. And that's one of the excellent points in this reasoned amendment that we have tabled, or have yet to formally table. I'm sure that the Honourable Friend will do before the conclusion of the speech. Yes. But does he agree with me that it's the SNP that would be delivering for the people of Scotland and not this government?
This is exactly right, and it's one of the many things that have been called for from the UK government. The UK government has been deaf to in terms of industry asking for these things, business asking for these things, begging for help quite often in terms of some of these issues. Now, this spring budget has introduced disastrous cuts to Scottish capital funding, with the aforementioned conspiracy of silence that the IFS pointed out permeating the halls of Westminster concerning the severity of cuts planned over the next Parliament. This government's legacy will undoubtedly be marked by the failures of its austerity measures, the calamitous aftermath of Brexit, and the misguided policies, misguided is a very gentle word, of Trussonomics. Austerity under the Tories has stripped our public services to the bone, exacerbated inequality and decimated living standards. This addiction to austerity, paired with our fiscal rules, has proven utterly ineffective at reducing debt, which as a percentage of GDP has tripled in the past 15 years. Now, the House of Commons Library itself reveals that the Scottish block grant is set to fall to its lowest ever level as a percentage of UK government spending in the history of devolution. Between 2023 and 2025, Scottish capital funding from the UK Parliament is projected to fall by 16.1% in real terms. These Tory cuts continue to wreak havoc across all areas of the UK, with councils across England, as we see, on the brink of bankruptcy, and many of them already in special measures. Regrettably, as mentioned, austerity will not end with the demise of the Tory party, as the Labour Party is also committed to these same spending plans and fiscal rules. Both the Tories and Labour are engaged in that conspiracy of silence. They've had the opportunity to talk about that level of austerity necessary in their view over the next Parliament, and it's a silence that threatens to cripple the already underfunded public services across the UK. With an estimated further £20 billion of cuts needed by their calculations over the next Parliament, it's imperative that both Westminster parties come clean about the level of austerity they intend to impose on Scotland and the rest of the UK ahead of the general election. The public has a right to know what extent these parties plan to decimate our public services should they come to office, and explicitly and specifically which departments will suffer the most severe funding cuts. We know that they both favour increasing privatisation of the NHS to facilitate their plans. Let's hear the rest. But all we have here today, Madam Deputy Speaker, is a zombie bill from a zombie government and the fag end of a zombie parliament, with activity in this chamber at record lows. The Chancellor's recent spending plans not only cut funding for Scotland, but also extended taxes on Scotland's natural resources, as we heard earlier and was heard around the chamber, which have been funding the UK's economy for so many years. They're offering little to stimulate growth in the Scottish economy. It's abundantly clear that neither of the Westminster parties possess the ambition required to invest adequately in our economy and reduce inequality. In Scotland, the SNP are supporting people through the cost of living crisis by freezing council tax, already lower by hundreds of pounds per year than the rest of the UK, using progressive taxation to ensure the majority still pay less income tax and the minority who can afford it pay a little more, by supporting working people, ensuring a strike-free NHS with better paid nurses and doctors, committed to keeping it in public hands, just like ScotRail, Scottish Water and more, helping families with 1,140 hours of free childcare, no tuition fees for students and much more. In Westminster, we've been given Brexit, a loss of over £100 billion a year to the economy, reduced available and skilled workforce, over £100 billion of fraud and waste, ballooning and unfair electricity charges, higher fuel debt, higher food prices, higher mortgages, higher rent, higher insurance costs, and a betrayal over the £28 billion per year needed for the just transition to our renewables, while our natural resources are exploited to the hilt. Our ability to build new things like hospitals and more sabotaged by enormous cuts to the budget for Scotland and more pressure on services to come. Barnett consequentials are just that, consequentials of decisions of this place. They have consequences, and Scotland sees that. Scotland needs the powers to introduce our own comprehensive industrial strategy, invest robustly in high-growth industry and effectively reduce poverty. The only path forward for Scotland is to have a government that truly plans to fix the economy and tackle inequality, and that is through an independent government in Scotland. Madam Deputy Speaker, I will be delighted to formally move our reasoned amendment.
Yes, yes. The original question was that the bill be now read a second time, since when an amendment has been proposed as on the order paper. The question is that the amendment be made. Nigel Mills.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it's a pleasure to speak in this debate. I was a bit worried when I got my copy of the bill from the Vote Office that they'd missed out the middle 500 pages or so. I mean, we're normally used to these bills being somewhat thicker than this, and I'm slightly nervous, Minister, that perhaps at this rate the Indians might catch up with the length of our tax code. I hope for the autumn you've got a nice large finance bill ready for us so we can keep our lead. I certainly think we do have some potentially complicated rules. We could have the new non-dom rules, the new inheritance tax based on residency rather than domicile, and how on earth we define a household for the high-income child benefit charge. So I think there probably is some meaty stuff to come, but I think it's probably fair to say there's not a lot of substantial excitement in this bill. Just to start with the SNP reasoned amendment, I think there's always risk with reasoned amendments to finance bill, because I think if we voted for this we wouldn't have any income tax this year, which would probably do quite a bit of damage to public services, but I could imagine it might be popular with a few people. I'm slightly intrigued at a time when we're really struggling for tax revenues and to balance the books, that anyone would think a priority would be reducing the price of a Rolex for very rich tourists, which is effectively what the reintroducing tax-free shopping does. It saves a lot of money for very expensive tourist purchases. I've never been convinced of the attractions of reducing VAT for the tourism sector, because the problem is it's a huge boon for hotel operators in London, which has to be raised by taxes elsewhere.
I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman giving way, and I'm happy to educate him. If he'd like to speak to any of the tourism organisations who've been calling for this, they'll find that it's a great way for them to not only cope with some of the increased costs they've got just now that are front-loading their business, but also a great way to encourage people to come and use their facilities. It's something that the tourist industry Treasury is very, very keen on, and I'd be delighted to introduce them to some people to educate them further.
It's a pity he didn't make the case for that in his own speech, actually, where he barely touched on this issue. But the point I was trying to make was that making that tax reduction has a huge benefit for London, which has high occupancy rates at a very high nightly rate, and then that money has to be raised elsewhere in the country. Now, what I would suggest actually is one of the advantages of Brexit, you won't like that, is we are now able to do differential tax rates by region. So if you wanted to actually have a tax rate targeted at boosting tourism, you could do it on the regional basis which has the lowest occupancy rate and the lowest employment rates. It would cost you far less, and you could actually have a much lower reduction. You could boost investment where you need it rather than where you don't. I would suggest to him that actually looking at that would be a more sensible way in proposing this. He then also is criticising the lack of a starter rate. Now, I remember when we had a starter rate of income tax from 1998 to 2008, it was for very low incomes, it was a 10p rate, and it was charged on top of national insurance, which was also over 10% at that point. What we actually have now is income tax starting at a much higher point, and we have national insurance starting at a much higher point. Actually, what we have is a 0% starter rate, which looks to me to be a far better idea than introducing a new one. So I certainly won't be voting for the reasoned amendment there. I think it would be somewhat against the interests of the country completely. I just want to touch a little bit on the high-income child benefit charge that the Minister referred to earlier. I would certainly urge him, it's slightly strange to bring a bill that increases the thresholds and promises us a radical change in the start of the tax year after the next one, but doesn't actually tell us what the government's trying to achieve by that. So quite rightly we've upped the starting point for this. But if you really want to go to a household calculation, either we're going to be very generous and have the household calculation starting at 120,000 and tapering up to 160,000, so it's the equivalent of two incomes as we've set out here, or you risk actually making the situation worse by having a very big disincentive for second earners. Because if you made the new threshold 100,000 rather than 80, a household with a second earner earning only £20,000 will bring themselves into discharge when they won't be in discharge for the current financial year. So on that basis, I wouldn't want to go down that line at all. So I think there's very real risks that what sounds like a very generous idea could have very negative impacts on encouraging second earners that I think we want to do via our childcare reforms and various other situations. So I just urge the government to think very carefully before they publish that consultation of where are they pitching this. Because there must surely become a point when you pitch household income so high that almost nobody will be paying this charge, in which case what's the point in all the complexity and the uncertainty and the cost of collecting it if you're not going to raise any money? You might be better off just putting the 45p rate of income tax up by half a p and raising the same amount of money and losing all this complexity that's there in the first place. On the measures that are in this bill, I think at the committee stage, it would actually, I think, be better if the Minister just introduced a automatic increase by inflation every year. It's actually been a terrible mistake since we introduced this that we kept the thresholds where they were. I think by far the simplest change here would be to inflate them every year, not drag more people into it. Everyone would understand what the position was going to be, and that would be easier than trying to work out how on earth are you going to decide, work out what a household is for purposes of this charge. Now, I think if you ask the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, he'll tell you that household formation and definition is one of the biggest areas of welfare fraud. Because people are pretending not to be a household to get extra benefits. Here you have people trying to pretend to be a household, or trying to pretend not to be a household in this situation, not to get. I think it can be extremely hard to actually work out what a household is, how you define it, how you enforce it, how much cost you're going to have to go to try and work out who's in a household and who's not. I just think I suspect what will end up here is such a complicated system to try and reintroduce a household definition into the tax regime where we don't have one anymore, that this will never actually happen, and if we did, it would probably actually cost more than it actually would really raise. I would just really think whether this is actually a sensible charge to retain if you're going to want to get the levels up to that high point. But just as a question of what's in the bill, what's the Minister's advice, given we now have a large range of earnings here, to people who aren't sure if they'll earn more than £80,000 or not, because they don't know what bonus they'll get this financial year? should they stick with the simple route that many people have done of just disclaiming the child benefit so you don't get caught by this tax at the end of the financial year that you need to save up for in case you've got to pay and it comes as a bit of a shock when you get there? Or should they actually go back to claiming child benefit in the first place on the off chance and then put the money in the bank and see if they're ever entitled to it? And if they turn out they didn't earn more than 80 grand, then they get to keep some of it and then they can spend it. I mean, it just seems to me that we've got a position here where there will be lots of households who won't know until very late in the financial year if they're caught by this or not. And if they disclaim it, they've lost benefit they probably were entitled to. And if they don't, they may have a bill that they're not sure they've got money for. So I just think having some certainty on that position, I will give it.
Thank you. I thank you very much for giving way, and he's making a very important point. I am concerned also about those families where they have stopped claiming child benefit. They're no longer on the system, but then find because of the new rules that actually they are entitled to it. How are they going to make sure that they get the full amount of benefit they're entitled to?
I agree with her. I think we are in a complex position here. And the question, Minister, is there some more generous allowance for retrospective claims we could have for this financial year to make people... It is a change, people haven't understood it. I suspect if they haven't already claimed, they're already missing out on some weeks of that benefit. Could we be more generous? If someone finds out towards the end of the tax year, actually, they would have been entitled to it in their household and they didn't think they would have been, but they can go and back claim it and get this money. Because child benefit is meant to be helping households with the extra costs of having children. There is a very good reason on that benefit has been around for many decades. It would be wrong to deprive households of it because they're a bit unsure about how much they're going to get it and they don't want uncertainty of a big bill later in the year. So is there a way we could be a bit more generous, at least in the transition year, and allow someone to have a catch-up claim late in the financial year in that situation? But with those very few remarks, I happily support this bill and I look forward to voting for it in second reading shortly.
Sarah Olney.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. After years of economic chaos, unfair tax hikes, millions of families suffering from this cost of living crisis, the Liberal Democrats will not be supporting this bill today. It's yet more evidence that this Conservative government has finally run out of ideas. For millions of families and pensioners facing soaring mortgage and rent payments, skyrocketing energy bills and eye-watering food prices, the measures in this bill will barely touch the sides. No real help with the cost of living, no plan for economic growth, no real support for our NHS and public services, and no end to this Conservative barrage of stealth taxes. Is this really the best the government has to offer? Thanks to this government, the British public have endured the biggest fall in living standards since the 1950s, and more across the country are rightly saying that enough is enough. Instead of more empty promises, what they want is a general election as soon as possible to get this tired government out of Downing Street and get our country back on track. Madam Deputy Speaker, recent weeks have seen desperate attempts from the Chancellor to convince people that he's cutting taxes in a veiled attempt to deceive the British public. But everyone can see this for what it really is, just a cynical deception. It'll be wiped out by frozen thresholds, the soaring cost of living and years of unfair Conservative tax hikes. Over this year and next, someone on average earnings will still be £383 worse off due to the government's freeze on the tax-free personal allowance. And yet, despite that, the Conservatives now expect people to be grateful for giving back just a small amount of what they've taken away. It shows that they are totally out of touch. Meanwhile, the government are completely failing to use their collected tax revenue in a fair way. For example, they've shown no interest in investing in the NHS. You can't fix the economy without fixing healthcare. We need to cut waiting times. We need to allow more of the 2.6 million people who are economically inactive due to ill health to return to work. On doorsteps across the country, people tell us time and time again how they cannot get a GP appointment, how they cannot expect an ambulance to arrive on time, they cannot see an NHS dentist. But instead of properly addressing this crisis, the Chancellor merely plugged a hole that he'd blown in the NHS budget in the first place. And that's why the Liberal Democrats have called on the government to deliver serious investment for our NHS, recruit more GPs, fix our cancer services, bring down waiting lists, and help people get the quality care that they so desperately need. Unlike this Conservative government, the Liberal Democrats will always stand for protecting our health services. The Chancellor either doesn't understand the damage done by his cruel cuts to public services, or he just doesn't care. The bill fails to introduce a proper windfall tax on the super profits of oil and gas producers. That revenue could be used to fund energy support for the most vulnerable, such as doubling the Warm Homes discount or launching a proper home insulation scheme, or it could also be used to invest in British farming to bring down food prices for the long term. This legislation also fails to reverse the tax cuts for the big banks, a measure that could fund support for vulnerable mortgage holders or renters. And yet, worst of all, the bill and the preceding budget take none of the vital steps that we need to grow the UK economy, such as launching an industrial strategy, reforming business rates and the apprenticeship levy, or reducing trade barriers for small businesses. The government have not just wrecked the economy, they've abandoned any strategy or plan for growth. Their lack of joined-up thinking has dire consequences for industry. Recently, we've seen the long and proud history of train manufacturing in the North East jeopardised, with the Hitachi rail factory in County Durham put at risk of closure due to the government not signing off an order from First Group. That jeopardises some 800 jobs. The abandonment of the industrial strategy has real consequences for people across the country. To conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, although the Liberal Democrats welcome some measures in this bill, such as changes to the high-income child benefit charge and the provision of tax reliefs for the creative industries, we simply cannot support a piece of legislation which fails to propose the solutions we need to get our economy moving. In his spring budget, the Chancellor could have proposed a fair deal for the British people and begin stimulating economic growth. Instead, he gave us more of the same, another underwhelming set of announcements from this Conservative government, which is out of touch, out of ideas and nearly out of time. Right across the country, voters are sick and tired of this Conservative government and are ready to vote for change at the next general election. Thank you.
Nickie Aiken. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As I highlighted in my remarks when speaking in the spring budget debate last month, I support the measures this government is taking to grow the economy, boost productivity and ensure long-term prosperity for families. Today I would like to focus on two clauses within this finance bill which I believe will have an extraordinary positive impact on the arts and culture sectors based in the cities of London and Westminster as well as across the country. First, Clause 16, which amends the Corporation Tax Act 2009 to permanently set the rate of credit to 45% for touring theatrical productions and 40% for non-touring. The rates were due to taper to 30% and 35% respectively in April next year, but will now be set permanently at 40% and 45% from that date. The measures laid out in this bill increase the tax relief available to theatre productions. And secondly, Clause 17, which increases the tax credits available for orchestral companies, which also amends the Corporation Tax Act 2009 to permanently set the tax credit rate at 45% instead of the planned taper at the end of this financial year. Madam Deputy Speaker, the performing arts sector plays a crucial role in the economy of the West End. According to the Office of National Statistics, 8% of the whole UK arts and cultural businesses in 2023 were based in the cities of London and Westminster. That equates to around 2,500 businesses and thousands of jobs. World-renowned venues including Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, the London Palladium, the Royal Opera House and the Royal Albert Hall not only attract audiences from all around the country, but also across the globe. The Society of London Theatre and UK Theatre recently produced a study which underscored the importance of the theatre sector to our economy. Their research showed that UK theatres generate £2.39 billion in GVA, supporting over 200,000 jobs and generating a total turnover of over £4.4 billion every year. And I am in no doubt that this uplift in tax credits will have a positive impact on actors, musicians, costume designers, set creators, singers, and a whole host of jobs which rely on a strong and prosperous performing arts sector. As we know, the past few years have been difficult for this industry. First, dealing with the shock of the COVID pandemic, which closed all shows, and then slowly emerging out of the crisis and rebuilding their businesses and their audiences. This government has worked tirelessly to support the creative sector in the cities of London and Westminster, and I was proud to work with the performing arts sector and others, such as UK Hospitality, to secure the £1.57 billion Cultural Recovery Fund to support large and small performing arts businesses throughout the dark times of the pandemic. What I learned from that experience, and the whole pandemic in general, is how connected the West End economy is. It is a jigsaw made up of complementary pieces: theatres, restaurants, hotels, cafes, bars. So much so that during this time we learnt that for every £1 spent in the theatre, an incredible £5 would be generated for hospitality and other businesses. So these tax clauses included in this bill will not only support the performing arts, they will also have a positive effect on the wider hospitality and leisure sectors, which will benefit the UK economy as a whole. Madam Deputy Speaker, whilst I fully support this bill and the included changes to tax relief, there is one specific issue I wish to raise, and that concerns the new definition of theatre production, which was introduced in the Finance Act 2024. The Society of London Theatres, UK Theatres and theatre companies based in the two cities have told me that immersive theatre companies will now not be eligible for the relief this bill offers due to the new definition of theatre production. The new narrow definition of what an audience is means that immersive theatre companies like Little Lions Entertainment, based in the West End, will be ineligible for the tax relief that is now provided in this bill. Madam Deputy Speaker, Little Lions Entertainment has been a recipient of theatre tax relief for the past 10 years. They employ 350 people in London and Manchester, and during their time have welcomed over 2 million patrons to their performances. Yet because of the change in definition, they fear for their future and the future of the entire immersive theatre industry. So I would be grateful to the Minister if he can consider looking again at the definition of theatre production so that companies such as Little Lion Entertainment and others are not excluded from the fantastic support this bill will provide. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm very proud of this government's continued support for the performing arts in the United Kingdom. This bill will continue to ensure that our world-renowned theatres and opera productions flourish and safeguard them for future generations.
Peter? Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I am specifically interested in clause 19 of this bill, which sets out the arrangements as to how the Energy Security Investment Mechanism will operate, so that the Energy Profits Levy will cease if the 6-month average prices for both oil and gas fall below certain thresholds. This provision follows on from the announcement of my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, in his spring budget, that the Energy Profits Levy would be extended to 2029, though it would be disapplied when energy prices return to normal. My interest in this issue stems from my roles as a constituency MP, where activity in the energy sector in the North Sea is vital to the local economy, and in chairing the all-party parliamentary group for offshore oil and gas. I have no particular issue with the mechanisms in clause 19, though I am worried that the current short-term approach to fiscal policy for the oil and gas sector does undermine other government objectives, in particular the enhancing of the UK's energy security, bringing new well-paid jobs to coastal communities such as Lowestoft, and in delivering our net zero targets. Madam Deputy Speaker, I acknowledge that my right honourable friend the Chancellor at the current time has an unenviable role and faces a significant dilemma. He is, in many respects, between a rock
and a hard place. He needs to balance the books, and he needs to support those families who are continuing to struggle with the cost of living crisis. It is thus understandable that he looks to energy companies to pay more as oil and gas prices have risen, they have been at very high levels. However, it should be pointed out that they have now fallen back to long-term averages. There is a significant risk that in pursuing such a course, he could imperil the inward investment which is needed to create long-term sustainable jobs in coastal communities for those very people who are currently struggling to make ends meet. Madam Deputy Speaker, the North Sea has been the UK's economic saviour for nearly 60 years. Some might say that we are now nearing the end of this particular story. That is not the case. The North Sea is transitioning from being a source of fossil fuels to the long-term home of renewables. That transition needs to take place as quickly as possible, but in a smooth and seamless way. This requires a stable and long-term fiscal policy, which I'm afraid at present we do not have. The decision to extend the levy for a further year was unexpected by industry and presents a significant further challenge to investor confidence. Madam Deputy Speaker, energy companies are making investment decisions on projects which quite often have timescales of the order of 40 to 50 years. The fact that in the UK there have been 4 fiscal changes in the last 2 years does deter and deflect investment elsewhere. These businesses are globally footloose, and they will go to those countries where the fiscal regime is favourable and has a large degree of certainty about it. In the past, the UK has ticked this particular box, though at present we are not doing so. It should also be emphasised that these businesses, that as well as operating worldwide, have interests in a wide variety of energy technologies, not just oil and gas, but also in the low-carbon businesses of today and tomorrow, offshore wind, hydrogen, carbon capture, utilisation and storage. If these businesses, if they find the fiscal regime unfavourable for oil and gas, they will invariably not invest in these renewables, which are so vital to our future. The initial feedback following last month's budget is that these concerns are well-founded, investment decisions are being delayed, and funds could well be diverted elsewhere. Offshore Energy UK, who provide the Secretariat to the Offshore Oil and Gas APPG, have identified £200 billion of investment, which was awaiting the green light and may not now happen. Cornwall Insight conclude that prolonging the levy could weaken investor confidence at a time when the UK is seeking record levels of investment to deliver the transition to net zero. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are at risk of imperiling that next chapter of the North Sea, an ongoing story that can not only deliver economic regeneration, but can also, over the remainder of this decade, provide 50 gigawatts of offshore wind, 10 gigawatts of hydrogen, 4 carbon capture, utilisation and storage clusters, as well as supporting the homegrown oil and gas industry and in helping meeting our decommissioning commitments. In short, Madam Deputy Speaker, unleashing an enormous amount of economic activity which can cascade right around the UK. To be fair to the Government, Clause 19 of this bill does seek to address these concerns, though I would urge them to map out a long-term strategy for offshore energy, building on the success of the 2021 North Sea transition deal. They are now adopting a similar course in the nuclear sector. We need to get back to doing the same in the North Sea. It is appropriate, Madam Deputy Speaker, to comment on the opposition's alternative proposal to extend the windfall tax. There is a real worry in the energy industry that this could exacerbate the worries that I have outlined. OE UK highlighted that these proposals could lead to the loss of 42,000 jobs and the wiping out of £26 billion worth of economic activity. There is a concern, which I would hope they could allay, that the opposition could be looking at removing those capital and investment allowances that are vital to securing inward investment. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are where we are, and I fear that some damage has been done. However, there is work to do to rebuild the UK's reputation as a prime destination for investment in the energy sector, and we need to get on with that task without delay. The industry has noted the government's commitment to honouring the sunset clause, and I urge my honourable friends on the front, the two ministers on the front bench, to provide those further reassurances that are needed to reinforce this message, both this afternoon in their responses and as this bill progresses through Parliament. The importance of ongoing and meaningful dialogue between government and industry cannot be overemphasised. In the period from 2012, after the last windfall tax, up to 2021, when the North Sea transition deal was agreed, this interaction was very much taking place. It has been lost in the past three very eventful years, but it needs to be restored as quickly as possible. If it is, then we can still embark on a new golden era for the North Sea. An era of a homegrown and not an outsourced energy transition. An era of reindustrialisation and not deindustrialisation. And an era of enhanced energy security and economic prosperity. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Shadow Minister Tulip Siddiq.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As my honourable friend for Ealing North set out in his opening speech, this finance bill and last month's budget are nothing but the last gasps of a dying, desperate government. Neither do anything to address 14 years of Conservative economic failure. And as always with this government, it's working people who pay the price because taxes are still rising. The British people, already facing the highest tax burden in 70 years, will see tax rises in every single year of the forecast period. And as much as the government try, they simply can't hide from this record. And after a decade and a half of Conservative rule, people have less money in their pockets. Unable to defend his own government's record and unable to offer any plan to get the country out of the economic mess that his party has created, this Chancellor has resorted to undeliverable promises. The Chancellor ended his budget last month with a £46 billion unfunded tax plan to abolish national insurance, which would put our economic stability at risk. This is even bigger than the unfunded tax cuts announced by the Right Honourable Member for South West Norfolk in her budget, which added hundreds of pounds to people's mortgages. And in contrast, our party have consistently said we would reduce the tax burden on families. And that's why, when the current Prime Minister wanted to increase national insurance 2 years ago, we opposed it. Why we supported the measures announced last month to bring national insurance down by an additional 2p. SNP. And while on the surface, this bill leaves the basic and higher rates of income unchanged, let's be clear, this is a government that has raised the tax burden to record levels, and taxes are continuing to rise. Because of the tax choices that this Chancellor has made, households will be on average £870 worse off. His decision to freeze tax thresholds will create 3.2 million new taxpayers by 2028 and 2.6 million more people paying higher rates. For every £5 that they're giving the families back, they'll be taking an average of £10 in higher taxes under their plans, and they expect the British public to thank them for it. Madam Deputy Speaker, while we'll always call out the Conservatives for pickpocketing the British taxpayer, we do welcome their recent pickpocketing of Labour policies. Labour has long argued that if people make Britain their home, they should pay their taxes here too. However, the Prime Minister himself said that scrapping the non-dom tax status would somehow end up costing Britain money. And the Chancellor previously tried to argue that the non-dom status supports jobs and that reforming it would damage long-term growth. Well, I'm delighted to say the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have finally come round to the Labour Party's way of thinking. But it isn't quite what it seems. I'm not denying that members opposite have come a long way after years of opposing our plan to scrap non-dom status, but there's still some gaping loopholes in the government's plans. The discount in year one is unnecessary and unjustified, and particularly concerning is the loophole that will allow non-doms to exploit offshore trusts so that they can avoid inheritance tax. And as my honourable friends for Ealing North made clear, these loopholes must be closed, and I hope the Minister will commit to closing these loopholes in his response today. So I wait with bated breath to hear what he has to say on this policy. If not, will he accept that the Conservatives are once again putting the interests of non-doms before ordinary British taxpayers and before British businesses? Take corporation tax, for example, which Clause 12 of this bill sets at 25%. All this Chancellor has had to offer British businesses is uncertainty. Despite promising to cut corporation tax from 19% to 15% in his 2022 leadership bid, he has increased it from 19% to 25%. In contrast, our Shadow Chancellor has committed to capping the headline rate of corporation tax at its current rate for the whole of the next Parliament. And we would take action if tax changes in other advanced economies threatens to undermine UK competitiveness. And on this side of the House, we'll also be supporting the Energy Security Investment Mechanism in Clause 19 of the bill before us today, as it will help investors give the confidence that they need. Likewise, we are committed to both strengthening the windfall tax to raise more revenue to support our country's energy transition and giving as much certainty as possible to the companies affected. And that's why our Shadow Chancellor has made it clear that under Labour, our one-off, time-limited energy profits levy will cease to apply by the end of the next Parliament. Madam Deputy Speaker, we will not be opposing the bill today, but we will be looking closely at the detail in the specific clauses in the coming weeks. But let's be under no illusions. This is an exhausted and directionless Conservative government, out of ideas and out of time. All they have to offer is U-turns, unfunded promises, and ever-growing tax burden on working people and our constituents. In contrast, the Labour Party's offer to the country will be carefully costed and fully funded and will always put working people and British businesses first. They have failed to reduce the tax burden, failed to boost business investment, and only delivered stagnation and chaos, whereas our economic plan is built on the pillars of stability, investment and reform. Stability brought out by iron discipline, guided by strong fiscal rules, robust economic institutions and certainty on corporation tax. Investment, working with the private sector so we can lead the industries of the future and make work pay. and reform, starting with our planning system to tackle vested interests. Madam Deputy Speaker, the British people deserve better than this. The British people deserve change. And I hope the Minister will agree with me that it's now time to call a general election as soon as possible.
Minister Gareth.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, always a pleasure to see you in the chair. Let me begin by thanking members from across the House for their contributions to this debate on this finance bill. Before I address some of the specific points raised, let me briefly reflect on what this bill is seeking to achieve. It's a bill for a budget that rewards work, that sends a clear message to working people across the country that we support you. We want your work to pay, and we want you to have more money in your pocket at the end of the working day. We want to continue to make this country a great place to live, work and invest, and to provide our key growth industries with the support and incentives they need to continue to thrive. Taken together, these policies will drive economic growth and productivity for years to come by focusing on workforce participation and stimulating business investment. And despite going through an incredibly difficult time these past years, with a global pandemic and a war in mainland Europe, our economy has now turned a corner. Inflation is down from its peak of 11% to 3.2%. Real wages are now consistently rising, and despite high interest rates, our economy is growing. Because of the action that we have taken over the past few fiscal events and the plan that we've put in place, always important to have a plan, Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill continues our work to execute on that plan. The bill will support hard-working parents by increasing the high-income child benefit charge threshold and taper, taking 170,000 families out of paying this tax charge, with almost 500,000 families gaining an average of £1,260 towards the cost of raising their children. My honourable friend for Amber Valley made some thoughtful remarks on our intention to move to a household basis. These are remarks that we will absolutely take on board. As he's aware and mentioned, we will be consulting on this in a very short period of time, and his points will be taken on board in that process too. My honourable friend for the cities of London and Westminster pointed out that this bill will encourage investment in our world-leading creative industries, a key growth sector for the UK, with a new tax relief for UK-made independent films. It will permanently increase the rates of tax reliefs for theatres, orchestras, museums and galleries, backing British talent on film and stage, because we'll always champion our creative industries, which remain the envy of the world. But she made some very specific points and specific challenges, particularly on immersive audiences. And I can tell her that production will qualify for theatre tax relief if the main purpose of the audience is to observe. Some level of audience participation will not necessarily disqualify a production, but it can be the main. It can't be the main purpose. I can tell her that further guidance will be issued by the Treasury, and I know my honourable friend, the Financial Secretary, would be happy to meet with her to discuss the specific issues that her constituents are facing. My honourable friend for Waveney has been a consistent champion for the oil and gas industry, and quite right too. He acknowledged that this bill will provide more certainty to investors in the oil and gas industry and the finance industry that lends for investment by putting the Energy Security Investment Mechanism into legislation. The ESIM operates on the principle, a very basic principle, that it's only right that when prices of oil and gas come down to normal levels, so too should the tax on exceptional profits. This gives certainty to industry and brings more fairness too. Now, my honourable friend for North East Bedfordshire made a typically constructive and, if I may say, creative speech. He made a number of points, but in particular his support for our national insurance contribution cuts was very much appreciated. He's right to highlight what is an underappreciated policy on auto-enrolment, which has seen 10.3 million people brought into saving for a pension. 86% of private pension savers are now participating more than they were before, and we will look closely and work with him on his specific suggestion as relates to national insurance contributions to boost savings. We all want that savings culture in this country to grow and grow, and we are always open to suggestions. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, on these national insurance contributions, which of course had its separate bill but continues to be a subject of debate in these Treasury discussions. The opposition's suggestion that our ambition to remove the double tax on work is some kind of unfunded policy needs to be addressed. Let me be clear. This is an ambition. It's obviously not happening overnight, but if you look at what we've done over the last 6 months for hardworking people across the country, we have cut national insurance contributions by 30%, all while increasing pensions by 8.5% and providing record funding for our NHS. In fact, this point about having an ambition in public policy is not new. In 2010, we set out a long-term ambition to raise the personal allowance to £10,000, which we didn't just meet, we exceeded it to now over £12,500, as acknowledged by my honourable friends for Amber Valley and North East Bedfordshire. It's important to set out a direction of travel for the British people, to show ambition for what you actually want to do in government. But when it comes to Labour, not only do they not have any long-term ambitions, but none of their ambitions seem to last very long. They talk about change, but the only change the Labour Party offer is a change of their own policies, week after week after week after week. And Madam Deputy Speaker, that's just weak. Labour's policies are so weak and so vague that even their righteous moral compass can't find a direction. But there are a few glimmers of what a Labour government may look like, what 5 years of hard labour may look like. We know, for example, that Labour's embattled deputy leader and the trade unions' 70 new regulations will hamper businesses' ability to hire, stifle their ability to grow, reduce job opportunities and unleash waves of low-threshold, zero-warning strikes on hard-working British people. They call it a New Deal, but let's face it, it's a raw deal for business and workers across this country. I haven't even mentioned the things that Labour Party are actually doing today where they are actually in charge. So let's just quickly go through those. 20-mile-an-hour zones, limited rates relief and longer NHS waiting lists, all in Labour-run Wales. A bankrupt council, adult social care budgets cut and council taxes up by 21%, all in Labour-run Birmingham. Knife crime up, relentless RMT strikes and a cruel ULEZ tax on motorists, all in Labour-run London. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, you'll forgive me if I won't take lectures from the party opposite. So, in conclusion, while we on this side of the House are delivering a finance bill that will see us move forward with the government's plan to support long-term growth, encouraging people into work, boosting investment and ensuring hard-working taxpayers keep as much money of their money as possible, we on this side of the House choose aspiration over envy and ambition over declinism. For these reasons and more, I commend this bill to the House.
Order. The original question was that the bill be now read a second time, since when an amendment has been proposed as on the order paper. The question is that the amendment be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. No. No. Division to the lobby. The question is that the amendment be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Gavin Newlands and Peter Grant. Tellers for the noes, Amanda Soloway and Mike Wood. Order.
The ayes to the right, 42. The noes to the left, 296.
Thank you. The ayes to the right, 42. The noes to the left, 296. So the noes have it, the noes have it. Unlock. The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. Division, clear the lobby. The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. No. Tell us for the ayes. Amanda Soloway and Mike Wood. Tell us for the noes. Gavin Newlands and Peter Grant. Still going on. Order. Order.
The ayes to the right, 296. The noes to the left, 49.
Thank you. The ayes to the right, 296. The noes to the left, 49. So the ayes have it, unlocked. Order, thank you. Programme motion to be moved formally.
I'd like to move.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, With the leave of the House, I will put motions 5 to 13 together. It is 5, Trade Union and Labour Relations Consolidation, 6, Financial Services and Markets, 7, Proceeds of Crime, 8, Proceeds of Crime, 9, Proceeds of Crime, 10, Prevention and Suppression of Terrorism, 11, Retained EU Law Reform, 12, Plant Tax, 13, Income Tax. Motions number 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Minister to move.
I beg to move.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, Thank you. Petition Alison Thewlis.